Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Starfest Presents Amanda Leduc. My name is Michelle. I am the Starfest director this year, and I am very excited and privileged to be part of St. Albert Public Library, where we're broadcasting from, and which sits on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Métis and First Nations people. This is a virtual event, but we do want it to be an interactive event. So throughout the presentation, please put your comments, put your questions in the chat, and we will incorporate that into the afternoon. If you haven't had a chance to purchase Amanda's book, The Centaur's Wife, we will provide links to Audrey's Books and Glass bookshop in the comments. We do have Centaur's Wife and her nonfiction book, Disfigured, at the library. If you haven't had a chance to read them, you will want to read them after this afternoon. So I am going to invite Amanda Leduc and Nisha Patel to pop on screen. Hey! And I'm going to I'm going to give you two a quick introduction, and then I'm going to disappear because I think you have a lot to talk about. And so first we have Amanda Leduc. She's the author of the novel, The Centaur's Wife, and the nonfiction book, Disfigured, on fairy tales, disability, and making space, which was shortlisted the 2020 Governor General's Award in nonfiction and the 2020 Barbellion Prize. I don't know if I said that right, but
you did. Yep.
Okay, good. She's also the author of an earlier novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, 2013. She has cerebral palsy and lives in Hamilton, Ontario, where I hope you're getting nice weather. Yesterday afternoon, there was a storm out there, but oh no, that was, yeah. She serves as the communications coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, FOLD, which is Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. If you haven't had a chance to check out FOLD or you didn't know about it, check it out. I attended this spring and it was excellent. And we're putting her in the hands of Nisha Patel, who is our regional writer in residence. She's serving Strathcona County Library and St. Albert Public Library. Some of you have met with her already. Nisha is an award-winning queer poet and artist. She was the City of Edmonton's 8th Poet Laureate and the 2019 Canadian Individual Slam Champion. Her first book, Coconut, came out this April. We also have Nisha's book at the library, and we'll also put a link if you're interested in buying it. So I'm going to hand things over to Amanda and Nisha. Once again, please put your comments and your questions in the chat. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And as mentioned, there's going to be a lot of time for questions from the audience. And if you have comments, especially good comments, please share them with Amanda. I am pretty sure every author wants to hear good feedback on their work. It is a chilly Sunday here in Edmonton. Amanda is coming to us from Hamilton. So again, like, it's really great to be in this online space, I think, just because, you know, there's so many authors that we've been able to take in the last week or so and put together in the same room, which might have been very difficult in other circumstances. So I'm really grateful for the library for hosting Starfest, and there's still events going on after this. And so make sure you go onto the website, try to catch some of the remaining authors. One of my favorites, Joshua Whitehead, is presenting tomorrow, for instance. And yeah, it's been really great. Amanda, welcome. I am so excited to chat with you today. One thing that I want to mention is that with Amanda's books as well, I think when I first received them, Amanda was just this author that I had heard so much about, and I never like sat down, like especially on Twitter that I followed, and I sat down and I finally like read the actual books because I have so many books of people I know or people that I follow that I never get to reading until like years later. So it was
I know that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Like the stack is endless.
Yes.
But yeah, it was a big privilege to actually sit down and take time and really delve into it. So I think it would be really, really awesome if you could share some of your work with the audience today and get them excited. Some of you might have already read it, and some of you might just be here for interest's sake. And as mentioned, all the books are available at the library and for purchase. So I'm going to give the floor to Amanda to share some of the works, and then we'll get to some Q&As.
So thank you so much, Nisha, and thank you to Michelle and to Starfest for putting on this great event. Just before we start, just in case anyone needs them, the closed captions are enabled for this session. So if you just click at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the CC live transcript button, if you click that, they will show up. Just again, if anyone needs them. So I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of my novel, The Centaur's Wife. And for those of you who don't know, it is a sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian fairy tale kind of a book, which weaves together a modern day narrative concerning a group of survivors who have come together in the aftermath of a meteor shower and are trying to build their lives back up again. And interwoven with this modern day narrative are fairy tales, along with a grander sort of overarching fairy tale, which may or may not concern some centaurs, and which may or may not be connected to the modern day narrative. And so I'm just going to read a little bit first from the beginning concerning the main character, Heather, who opens the story just having given birth to twins. And then I will read from one of the fairy tales in the book as well. So you get a bit of a taste of different parts of it. So this is chapter 1, or from chapter 1. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Don't worry. Heather is sleeping when they come, the meteors raining from the sky. The twins, born only the day before, lie in a crib next to her hospital bed, their fingers laced together even in sleep. Greta and Jilly, Jilly and Greta. Bee is rumpled in the corner chair, snoring softly. Heather opens her eyes in the seconds before it happens, something having jolted her awake. Some dark dream or memory, her father tumbling down the side of that mountain so long ago. She lies silent, eyes open. The clock reads 5 a.m. In that tiny flash before the world ends, she thinks about crawling out of bed, sliding out the door in her slippers and running far away. But then she hears a whistle, so loud the walls tremble. A whistle and then a great crash outside. The ground shakes. Heather turns to look out her window, so slow, and all she sees are flames. Bee is awake now and moves to the window like a ghost. The girls are crying. Someone outside in the hall is screaming. Heather hasn't moved from the bed. Bee looks outside and then back at her. She can see that he thinks he's still dreaming. The world's on fire, he says, too confused to be afraid. Heather swings her legs over the side of the bed and joins him at the window. Walking hurts. She can hear people running in the hall, more crashes, more screams. She stands beside Bee and watches giant balls of fire rain down from the sky and smash into buildings, cars, the orderly trees that line the roads. The smell of burning metal permeates the room. The rock, is that what it is, that slams into the hospital hits close enough for them both to feel the heat of it. They run to the babies and scoop them from their crib, and then they slip out of the room, bent and shaking. Basement, someone shouts. We all have to get to the basement. There are many people moving through the halls, and even more crying out from their hospital beds. Help me, please. The elevators don't work, so they stumble down the stairs, Bee breathing hard beside her, his hand on her elbow as she limps as fast as she can go. The baby's crying, the screams of everyone else ringing in her ears. Another crash outside, another flush of heat that trembles through the wall. They climb down and down and down. At last, they find themselves in an old stone foundation. The air is damp and musty here, but also hot with panic. People jabber and weep, shout into their cell phones. I can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. Heather collapses softly against a wall and tries to breathe. Bee huddles beside her. Are you all right? He says, pitching his voice low so it can find her in the din. She can't speak. She only nods. More people keep coming down the stairs. They are screaming and sobbing, some of them bloody. Another crash above them and everyone shrieks. The lights flicker, go out, come back on again. She thinks about the people hooked up to machines, the people they left behind. Soon there is hardly room to sit. Bodies press so close around her, she fights the urge to panic. Breathe in, she thinks. Breathe out. She closes her eyes and tries to imagine the mountain air, but all she can picture is fire on the mountain too. The mountain. The ones on the mountain and fire. Is he there? She wonders. Is he all right? And now I'll just skip forward. As I said, there are a number of fairy tales woven through the book. They go in between all of the chapters. And this one is towards the beginning as well, and it's called Mother Fox. Once there was a fox on the mountain, and she wanted babies more than anything else in the world, but she didn't know how to get them, and so she asked the mountain. The mountain told her, "You must go down off this mountain and into the grasslands where the sun shines and casts no shadow. Once there, find a rock and pry it up from its resting place so that the earth beneath the rock sees the sun for the first time. Say to the rock, I am ready to bring you into the world now, and turn in 2 circles. If it thinks you deserve them, the rock will give you your babies." "The rock doesn't know who I am," the fox said. "Everyone knows who you are," said the mountain. "You're the fox. You have red hair and a long red tail. The trees recognize you. The ground knows the way your footsteps feel different than a deer's. The rock will know you too." "But how will the rock know I deserve babies?" the fox asked. "How will it know I am worthy?" To this, the mountain made no answer. The fox went down the mountain anyway. She was quick and light and small and knew how to hide when larger creatures, bears, a wolf, an orange-brown coyote that grinned at her through the trees, got in her way. She found the grasslands with no trouble. She even found a rock. After she lifted it, she turned herself in 2 careful circles, then sat and spoke the words, "I am ready to bring you into the world now." But when the fox looked down at the earth beneath the rock, she saw only dirt and worms. She was confused. There was no mountain around to tell her what to do next, so she walked farther through the grasses and found another rock and lifted it. She turned herself in 2 circles again and spoke the words once more. "I am ready to bring you into the world now." Again, only dirt and worms. The fox, puzzled, went back to the first rock. She reached out a paw and touched it. It was warm, which surprised her. She'd never touched warm rock before. "The sun warms me," the rock said. It didn't actually speak, but the fox heard it anyway. "The sun warms rocks differently on the mountain." "I am ready to bring you into the world now," the fox said again, thinking that perhaps the rock hadn't heard her. "I know," the rock said. "The babies were waiting for you when you turned me over." "But," the fox said, not understanding, "I saw only dirt and worms." "Can't worms also be babies?" the rock said. "Don't they also deserve to be in the world?" "I don't know anything about worms," the fox said. "I don't know what they eat. I don't know how to keep them safe." "Well, no one knows at first," the rock said to her, "but everyone can learn." The fox, understanding, was ashamed. She sat back on her haunches and looked at the rock for a while. "I am ready to bring you into the world now," she said again. And the worms crawled out of the dirt to her, and she was very happy. And I'll just leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're
There's
so welcome.
so many great fairy tales in the book, and as Amanda is saying, there's the narrative and the story that's going on, and then there's this real I think subversion of like the classic Western fairy tale. And for those of you who are in the audience who maybe have not read any of Amanda's work, like there's a lot of discussion in Disfigured as well as this book about who we prescribe badness or evil to in these stories, and who gets to be the good guy, who gets to be the princess, as you mentioned in one of your chapters in Disfigurement. What do princesses look like? Are they people who have limps? Are they people who have disfigurement? Is it the old witch with the humped back, you know, who steals the children and stuff like that? And so there's so many like really fascinating questions and assumptions that I think the reader goes through. And I know for me as a disabled author as well, someone who is working through these things, it's been really refreshing and really meaningful to have access to your work. So I'm going to start with some questions. I appreciate it. So, just and of course, like if you don't feel like answering them, we can pass. We can keep going. There's going to be questions from the chat coming in as well. And my first question is really, did you have a favorite story or a fairy tale or legend or, you know, myth growing up that fed into your desire to rewrite the narrative for this book?
That's a great question. And I guess I have to split it in two parts, because I absolutely did have a favorite fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, specifically the Disney version, not the Hans Christian Andersen version, which I didn't read until I was quite a bit older. But the Disney version was my favorite fairy tale growing up. I loved the story. I loved how it ended. I loved that Ariel and Eric ended up together at the end, although I can look at it now with hindsight and be like, there are many things about this that are problematic. But in terms of wanting, a fairy tale that inspired the Centaur's wife specifically, and then also Disfigured, and looking at that, there wasn't really one in particular. I had just always loved fairy tales. With Disfigured, the idea for that book came, I was away at a writing retreat, and I was walking through the forest essentially, and recognizing as I was moving through the forest that it can be quite an inaccessible space. Forests are very, unwieldy places. You can't really move wheelchairs or mobility devices around them unless there are already paths that have been cleared. And so I was thinking about how forests keep people out, but then this sort of magical, sort of idealized version of the forest that we have in our head as a result of fairy tales actually includes disabled people a great deal. But the reason that we don't think about disabled people as disabled people in the fairy tales that we read is because it's essentially a plot device in these stories, right? It's never actually the lived reality of someone. And so in The Little Mermaid, in the Disney version, she has to learn how to walk because she doesn't have her tail after she, is transformed by the sea witch. And there was a real recognition of that when I was younger. Ariel trying to walk and stumbling was in many ways how I felt about myself walking, right? Because I have a pronounced limp, and I move in a different way. And although I wasn't cognizant of it at the time, I think there was a real, Ariel gets legs and walks perfectly by the end of the story. And, there was a real sense of her transforming into a body that ultimately was the body that she wanted. And it took me a long time to recognize that I've always been drawn to fairy tales and to fantasy and to science fiction stories, in large part because they deal with this aspect of transformation in some way. And fairy tales in particular deal with transformation of the body. So you often have, the Brothers Grimm have a fairy tale called Hans my Hedgehog, which is about a half human, half hedgehog boy who, grows up and, spoiler alert, falls in love with a princess and then finds this magical way to become fully human and doesn't have to be half animal or half human anymore. And a lot of tales follow that reasoning, right? So someone starts out disabled at the beginning of a fairy tale, and by the end of the fairy tale, they've sort of proven themselves through trial and triumph, and they're made able-bodied. And so I was really interested first in examining what that meant from like a cultural perspective. So that's what Disfigured is about, is a memoir about my own journey as a disabled woman, but also setting that against how disability is perceived culturally. And then with The Centaur's Wife, what I wanted to do was take those elements of both fairy tale and dystopia and this kind of the hero narrative, the hero or the savior narrative, where you have one person who, comes to save the day, essentially, and not even turn it on its head so much as kind of lay it open, grab that rock off the ground and lay it open to the sun and see what's illuminated in there. Centaur's Wife is very much about grief and trauma and disability, very much so for Heather in particular, but also for other characters. And the way that they all engage with those things was, for me, speaking directly to the kind of easy pat narrative that fairy tales often take. And I think as children, fairy tales are great because we can, beginning, middle, end, you kind of instinctively understand how they go, right? There's a beginning, then there's a trial, and then there's a triumph at the end. And what does that kind of storytelling, and what does that sort of assumption of how stories will go, what does that do out in the real world? How does the way that we're shaped as children by these stories contribute to how we view stories and certain bodies and certain narratives in the real world today? So that, all of this stuff has kind of been percolating in my head for a long time.
Yeah, one of the questions we have in the chat is, and I think you mentioned a little in Disfigured, but when did you start writing the fairy tales? That did they come first and then the narrative of the book, or was it the other way around, or did they kind of happen at the same time?
They actually happened almost at the end. So the Centaur's Wife took a while to write. Probably, well, it was kind of from beginning idea to arriving on the shelf with about 7 years, and I'd say active writing, thinking of it as a novel during that period, was probably from fall 2015 to fall 2019, so about 4 years. And there were like 6 or 7 drafts in there that it's just, I scrapped it and then started all over again. And it was originally just the modern day narrative, and then this sort of narrative with these centaurs and this kind of magical just magical exploration, and it was difficult to try and find ways to tie them together. And then I realized as I was approaching the end of writing the book that really what the fairy tales are doing is they're about survival. They're stories that people are telling themselves to, make their way through trauma, which essentially is what fairy tales do. Actually, they're very much about trying to understand the world in some way, shape, or form. And so the fairy tales, and the great thing about the fairy tales is they kind of came fully formed. Like I wrote them, and I don't think any of the fairy tales in the book really had any substantial edits in any way. They just sort of came out, and they were these little vignettes that just, there's 2 main characters in the book, Heather and Tasha, and their chapters are interspersed with these fairy tales, and each fairy tale pertains to a particular character. So some fairy tales speak to Heather's journey specifically, and some speak to Tasha's. And so that was really kind of magical. I know it sounds cheesy, but it was a magical way for them to arrive, because they really, I think I had to do a lot of work with thinking about what the overall point of the book was, really, for the fairy tales to then arrive and tie it all together.
Yeah, that's I think that's so important for us to recognize that, like some books take a really long time to write, and some of them are, as you mentioned, like 7-year processes. And that's not even to say what the publishing process is like, which is another additional, anywhere from 1 to 5 years in some cases. So yeah, it's a big commitment, I think, and I think we're all really happy you went through with it. I think sometimes as disabled authors, we are put into narratives where, we must hate ourselves, or we must, want to be cured of our disabilities, or we must, want to be able-bodied in many ways. And I think some of those themes are in this book as well, right? Where Heather comes up against them in other people, but holds for herself a truth that is very different in many ways. And I just wonder, what was the value for you in writing a story about disability that I think is in many ways very inspiring, not in the sense of, being a hero, but in the sense of being true to some of the experiences that disabled people have?
Well, I think, again, great question. I think you know, one of the core issues with disability representation in the world today is that there isn't enough of it. So people sort of, especially the non-disabled world, sees, you know, one depiction of disability, whether it's someone in a wheelchair or someone using a cane. And they sort of form this idea of what disability is, what disability is like. When the reality is that disability is a spectrum, and it can run all the way from, you know, people who have mild visual impairments or have anxiety or have chronic fatigue or other, you know, so-called invisible disabilities, to people who are reliant on, you know, mobility aids and other mechanisms in order to help them survive. And we don't see that spectrum in representation a lot. And within that nuance, you know, everybody who is disabled in a different way, and their approach to disability is different in a different way. So I wanted to be really cognizant of that and aware of the fact that, you know, it's not like a fairy tale that ends happily, you know, and has everything, all of the ends tied off neatly. Being disabled is being human, right? And disabled people have as much capacity for happiness and joy and sadness and struggle as anybody else. And so it was really important to me to get that across in the book by making the main character, Heather, making her complicated in many ways, and making her relationship to her disability complicated in the sense that, you know, she in many ways is comfortable with herself and who she is and how she moves, but she's very wary of how other people perceive her. And she, you know, she definitely puts up walls, and she's very prickly in many ways because she doesn't trust people, right? And this creates real problems for her in her marriage. You know, it creates problems for her when she's interacting with other people around her. Tasha in particular is a character who tries to befriend Heather at multiple points throughout the book, and Heather just keeps putting up walls. And it, you know, I think it's important to talk about that. I think that it's important to talk about the fact that disability can be a very difficult road, not just because of the way that your body, you know, the way that the world around you is not built for your body, but also because of the different ways that you socially interact with people, right? And the expectations that people have of disability and how you have to continually navigate around that. One of the things that I talk about with Heather is that she has cerebral palsy like myself and has a limp like myself. And some days her limp is very noticeable, and then other days her limp is not so noticeable. And that was something that was important to me to put in, because that's how I walk. Like on days if I'm really tired or if my leg hurts, you know, the limp will be more visible than others. If I'm wearing high heels, which, you know, I rarely ever wear high heels anymore. But if I do, you know, it really exacerbates the limp. And a lot of people just sort of assume that if you know, have a limp or if you move in a particular way, you always move exactly that particular way. When the reality is that, again, there's room for lots of nuance in this. And I just want people and readers and writers to be open to the ways in which disability is different and has so many ways of being.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's such an important kind of mindset to approach the work with, you know, that there isn't just like one worldview, that everyone's experience is different, and also that our understandings of ourselves evolve over time. You know, a child who dislikes the way their body looks, a child who undergoes bullying, you know, grows up and understands their body in evolving ways, and that understanding changes and that relationship to the self changes. All like very, very important, I think, to disability literatures. The idea of fairy tales for me, like, I will admit, like, maybe I'm not in the fairy tale genre world as like what a modern fairy tale is. Like, to me, fairy tales are the Hans Christian, you know, like these older ones that we've heard before. And so I'm just wondering, like, what you think the future of like the modern fairy tale is going to be as we continue to confront, you know, widespread structural and societal issues of change.
Well, I think, you know, the modern fairy tale is definitely a genre that has grown I mean, it's always been around. You look at authors like Angela Carter, who was doing some really interesting things about re-examining fairy tales in the 1970s. And then now we have authors like Kelly Link, authors like Amber Sparks, both in the States. Karen Russell does a lot of work which, interweaves and kind of looks at fairy tales anew in many ways. Another writer in the States that you should know and check out is Ross Showalter. He's deaf, and he also has cerebral palsy, and he writes a lot of stories which, sort of rest on that line of speculative fiction and Gothic horror as well. And I guess the interesting thing for me, so many things are interesting about it, but the modern day fairy tale, people really are subverting it in crucial ways, right? You have even things like, arguably Wicked, right? And the musical and all the sort of offshoots that came from that is a modern day fairy tale, which takes, a narrative that is relatively modern, but even so, builds on that and makes something different out of that. And Gregory Maguire has done other books as well that build on that sort of idea. And I think the power in that is that we recognize that, there's something, these stories have a certain kind of staying power, like they sit with us in really interesting ways because they are about how to navigate the terrible nature of the world, right? How to make sense of things that don't make sense. A lot of fairy tales are about grief and sorrow, and the Hans Christian Andersen ones and the Brothers Grimm fairy tales are very much about death and dying and how to deal with that. And I think modern day fairy tales are still focused on these things, which are eternal, right? These are questions that we always have, but they breathe new life into them in really key ways, whether that's, shifting from the perspective of Dorothy to this perspective of the Wicked Witch, or, turning in St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, Karen Russell does some really interesting things with the idea of the werewolf, right? And that distinction between what is animal and what is human. And in so doing, these authors are asking really pertinent questions about what it means to be human in the world today. And they're doing it in a way that is maybe not everyone's cup of tea. Not everyone is a speculative, fiction reader or a fairy tale reader, but the images stick with you, I find, in a way that's really particularly special.
Yeah, that's so important. I think just in the broader narrative. I don't know if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, as it's an incredibly okay, yeah. I also spend a lot of time on Twitter. There's two things I want to ask you related to Twitter things that happened this week. The first is whether you think this is a bones day for you. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, there is a 15-year-old pug on the internet, and his owner props him up in the morning. And if he stays standing, it's a bones day. And it's a day where you have the full capacity to take on the day. And if he goes back to sitting down, then it's kind of called a no bones day. And people have really, I think, rallied around this idea of how much energy and how many spoons we have, to get through a day, how much energy we have to keep going. For disabled people, this is not a new concept. We assess our energy levels every day. We have to figure out where we're going to put our efforts to. So I'm just wondering, doing a little check-in, like, is today a bones day for you?
Well, today is a bones day, absolutely. But it's because I woke up and I was like, I have this event, and then I do not have to do anything else today. Yeah. Like I can just fill it with what I want to fill it with. And it's something that really makes me think, because I've been very lucky over the last couple of years working with the Fold, has offered a great deal of flexibility, so I can sort of bend my schedule according to my energy levels. I think disabled people are often particularly bad for overworking, right? Because we always sort of feel like we have to prove ourselves in order to stay in our jobs, or to like show that we're still contributing members of society. So please don't cut my benefits and blah, 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 all those kinds of things, right? So I do have a tendency to overwork and to really sort of push myself in ways that I should not. And I have trouble with relaxing. And I'm really trying to work on that. But today I was like, okay, I'm going to force myself to relax, and then do this event. So I have more energy, I think, because I've been conscious of that. Having said that, I have also vacuumed the entire downstairs, and I walked the dogs twice, and you know, have done 3 loads of laundry. So there's still that like workaholic problem. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has really highlighted for me is 40 hours a week is too much for anybody to be doing, honestly, like in a full-time job. You know, I think about when I started working from home and had more flexibility with my schedule, I was able to, you know, book more doctor's appointments and like get health checkups and do all of these things that I was supposed to have been doing before and just didn't have time to fit in. And I think about what everyone is carrying and has been carrying over the course of the pandemic. I just think that there are things that need to go. Like there are things that we need to accept about what a productive society means, and whether, you know, a productive society is what we should value so much as a society where everyone is, you know, given what they need and taken care of and allowed the space to take care of themselves. It's a very long, rambling answer to the spoons question, but or the bones question rather. But I think it's important because, you know, it's okay to say that today is a no bones day. And it's also okay if you have like, you know, 7 got bones, going to do lots of stuff days in a row. And we need to just normalize that, right? Normalize the way that people move through the world and normalize how people have or don't have energy and how they use that or don't. Yeah, disability activism is so much about getting people to recognize that we all occupy space in the world in a different way, and just to leave grace for that for everybody. Yeah.
No, that's that leads me to we had a lovely comment in the chat. I'm going to read just the first half of it and then get to the question. But Vicky from Toronto says, I'm sitting in Toronto, tuning into an Alberta-based book festival, listening to a reading from an author in Hamilton while texting with a book-loving friend in Edmonton. Much as I miss live readings and book launches, what has the pandemic compelled event organizers / artists to do to communicate with readers, you know, online? And the question is really, as both an author and an events administrator as you are, how do you feel about the future of virtual or hybrid events, even as people are slowly moving back to enjoying live events again?
That's a great question, Nikki. Thank you. I think one of the things that, you know, we need to acknowledge there is that not everybody is as yet moving back to enjoying live events again, right? Like some people are, some people have been able to, and then there are some people who still are in a place where it's not safe for them to enjoy live events. And I think, you know, we need to be mindful, especially as this particular pandemic continues to drag on. We need to be mindful of that fact that not everybody is able to enjoy live events. And it's something that, you know, has been a little bit disheartening to see with some other, just, you know, and this goes across North America, across the UK, seeing other festivals move back to in person and have it just sort of be a collective sigh of relief from these organizations, like, oh, thank God we get to move back to in person. And they take away the virtual element. And I think first and foremost, for me, speaking from the disability community, I mean, there are disabled people who will always not be able to go to in-person events as a result of, you know, the funding, the transportation, like inaccessible venues, which are still happening. So I really think it's incumbent on event organizers to actively think about hybrid events going forward and making that permanent in such a way that you think about, you know, the funding for these things well before you put them on, right? So you're thinking about the change on a structural level. I think one of the great things about the online experience as well is that it has been beneficial not just for the disability community, but for people from other communities, right, or other provinces who are able, much like Vicky, to tune into an event that's being held in Alberta when you yourself are still snug in your home in Toronto or Hamilton, as the case may be. And I think there's real opportunity for making the community even larger in many ways, and also making it smaller at the same time, right? Literary festivals in Canada in particular have, up until 2 years ago, been very siloed, right? Where, someone would come to a Hamilton Literary Festival and that would sort of be it. And an author could go to a Vancouver Literary Festival and rest assured that they, are interacting with an entirely different audience. Well, now, there's the possibility of readers and writers in Vancouver and Hamilton to be interacting virtually in ways that, weren't possible before. And I think that's really exciting. I just think, for me, I have a I have a real horse in this race, as the case may be. But I think all of the decisions about how we move forward with hybrid events need to take disability into account first and foremost, because making access easier for disabled people actually makes access easier for everyone. Both the disabled and non-disabled communities. So it's really something that I encourage people to think about, to be going into events, both as spectators and as organizers, and constantly be thinking, who is missing from this space? Can everyone get into this space? If they can get into the space, then can they all access the content? Because that's not always the case, right? You have something in an inaccessible venue and someone who uses a wheelchair or a mobility device is not going to be able to get in, regardless of if you make it free, right? You have something that is in a wheelchair accessible venue but doesn't have captions, then someone who is deaf is not going to be able to access that content. And so what are the things that we could do? What are the questions that we need to ask ourselves to really be pushing this work forward? Because the truth of the matter is, pre-pandemic, all of the work that we were putting in as festival organizers and event organizers was incomplete. We were not doing everything that we needed to be doing to include as many audiences as we might have liked to. And it's been, a hard lesson in many ways. But I think it's also been very valuable. And I really hope it's a lesson that we carry forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been, I myself was in a literary event organizer for most of the pandemic. And there was this whole camp of people who were like, well, we should do it in person, we should do it at a distance. And this was like pre-vaccine. And I was like, I can't, like, I will literally die. And then afterwards, there was also this push. Then suddenly people were like, we should do hybrid, we should have elements of both. We should do a little bit here and there. And we should make sure everyone, as many people as possible, can attend. You quote Leah Lakshmi in from Care Work in your book Disfigured, when you talk a little bit about disability justice and how Leah Lakshmi has this really great anecdote where they talk about how, people will make accessible events and they will have the ramps and they will have, seating that is not upstairs, and they will have, ASL interpreters, and they'll put on big events, they'll do the marketing, and no disabled people actually show up or come because they've created the entire event without conversation with actual disabled people. And I'm just wondering, like, what conversations or what demographics is your book in conversation with so that these kinds of things don't happen, going forward for people writing in the same vein?
I mean, I think, I need to acknowledge first and foremost that Disfigured and the Centaur's Wife, my work comes from a very particular place of privilege, and I am, I try to be really conscious of that all the time. I mean, I am disabled and I deal with very real issues as a result of my disability, but I also have a lot of abled passing privilege. I can go up, like I can walk upstairs on a stage, you know, if there's no ramp, I can still get up there. I can still get into these venues that many of my colleagues and friends are barred from. I mean, I actively choose not to go in to, you know, be in solidarity with my friends who cannot go. But I think the issue, you know, it begins very much, as Leah mentioned, with listening to the disability community and making sure, I mean, the slogan, right, is nothing about us without us. You need to involve disabled people every moment along the way when you're creating and planning an event. And the work is not easy. I wouldn't want to, you know, give any illusions that it is. It's not easy for myself as someone who has these levels of privilege, and you know, it's certainly not easy for people for whom that privilege may not be there. But I hope, especially in my work with, you know, the melding of the fairy tales and looking at these older narratives that many people are familiar with, I hope to participate in the conversation in a kind of gateway manner, so that people who maybe haven't had experience with disability before, or haven't, you know, had to think about these kinds of considerations, can think about them now and can see the world in a new and different light. I mean, I have hope that this is a conversation, especially because of the pandemic, more people are having. And so it's a conversation that we can keep pushing forward, because the reality of the matter is, you know, the work of accessibility is never actually done. There are always things that you can do to improve, and there are always things that we can be fighting for and arguing for. And I hope through my work to help non-disabled people in particular, but everyone, recognize that access is something that everyone should be fighting for, not just disabled people. Because again, access is a human right, and we should all be concerned with human rights, you know? And not that, I mean, this isn't the most important part of it by far, but if you make something accessible, everybody can enjoy it, right? If you look at things like curb cuts or ramps, they were created initially specifically for disabled people, but curb cuts in particular make it really easy for people who are pushing strollers or people who are pushing delivery trolleys to, you know, move their stuff along a sidewalk. And I would really like people to think about access like that. Captions on films, originally something that was created for the deaf and hard of hearing community, but it actually can be quite useful for everyone, especially in what seems to be a very mumbly age of Hollywood. There have been many a movie that I have seen lately where I, you know, have difficulty understanding what people are saying, and the captions have really helped with that. So yeah, I hope that my work can operate in that manner, right? To really get people to see the world differently.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat that I want to get to. The first
Sorry, I keep talking.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure people know that I'm seeing them and that I have integrated them. The first is, how easily accessible is the Centaur's wife outside of Canada?
Sadly, it's not very accessible at all. It was only sold in Canada, so it is going to be part of the Penguin Random House US distribution arm, probably closer to the end of the year. So hopefully by the beginning of 2022, you'll be able to order it on bookshop.org or have it ordered in from your friendly independent retailer. In the absence of that, though, I am quite happy to send copies out on my own, and they can be autographed, and I can, you know, write lovely little personalized messages in there for you. If you're interested in getting a copy, please check out my website at amandaleduc.com. I will write it into the chat. And someone asked about the name of the author that I mentioned earlier, and it's Ross Showalter, and I'll put that in here.
We put a little link to Ross's website as well.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's really good to know. Also, Glass Bookshop locally here in the Edmonton area will deliver internationally as well.
Amazing.
not deliver by hand, but they will mail the book out as well. And if you are in the Edmonton, St. Albert, or Sherwood Park area, they will deliver to your door for free if you would like to order from that. All the festival books are, again, also available from the library. We have another question. So this is specific to the story. And I will say, I'm going to try to repeat it with as few spoilers as possible. But essentially, there's like a big devastating event. There's the meteor shower, and not like one of those pretty ones that you like wish on, but like a big devastating one where the meteors come down and destroy the cities and the towns that people are living in, big, fiery, horrible things where people die. And there's also a second horrifying event, or a cataclysmic event, as Michelle is saying. Why do you feel that, like, what was the reason you felt you needed to have that second event come into this novel?
Well, I didn't, it just kind of showed up initially. I was writing, and this isn't a spoiler either, but there, you know, as the novel progresses, you get a sense of kind of the natural world sort of taking back things. Humans are kind of scrambling to come together in the wake of this catastrophe. And meanwhile, you know, the trees and everything around them are growing really rich and growing really vibrant in color and things like that, and really kind of malevolent in weird ways. And as I was writing this, all of a sudden this particular thing happens in the book, this particular devastation. And I remember writing it and thinking, oh no, everybody's just going to be so depressed by this book. But I think what, again, one of the central questions of the book is about grief, and the way that grief comes out of nowhere, right? Both like the trauma that sort of is the initial cause of grief, and then grief itself, dealing with it comes at you out of nowhere. And so it was important for me, I think, ultimately, to keep that in, to keep this second devastation in, because I wanted the book to show and speak to how it is quite possible to survive multiple catastrophes, multiple griefs that we carry over the course of our lives. You know, you do grow larger so that you can contain, even though it doesn't feel like it at the time, you can contain these sadnesses, you know, and you can also contain joys and hope, and you know, survival can all be held at the same time, even though it may not feel like it. Yeah.
I think that leads me to, there's a really great question in the chat that I'll just get to in a bit, but I had mentioned there was like 2 Twitter based questions that I had for you. And one of the other ones is that, I don't know if you know, if it was just on poetry Twitter or if it hit like general writing Twitter, but there was this tweet that was like, oh, like we should be writing more likable characters. We should be writing happier books. You know, like we're all in this devastating time, even though many of us have been in devastating times before, and constantly. And there's this, I think there's a lot in this novel where I was like, you know what? I'm not everyone's best friend in this story. You know, what do you think your obligations are to write towards joy, but also to write towards that complicated narrative where there are multitudes of emotions at play?
I mean, I think first and foremost that writers and artists on sort of an initial level have no responsibility to write for anyone other than themselves, right? So you don't actually have to write a happier book as a writer. You can write whatever book you want, and if it's a book that is sad and depressing, that is totally fine, because chances are that sad and depressing book will resonate with someone on a level that, you know, means there's a kind of communication happening. I think as writers, we put words out into the world so as not to feel alone. And as readers, we are bringing in words so as not to feel alone. And there's that kind of connection that happens that's really crucial. I think the impulse to be writing happier books, you know, stems from that kind of escapist fervor that comes when you deal with difficult things, right? You want to watch Marvel movies or watch like rom-coms or, read rom-coms, which is not to, disparage romantic comedies in any way, shape, or form. Like, I think there's a real value and a real service that books which offer escapism, and stories and television and film that offer escapism, there's a very real service that happens there. And it's interesting because one of the things that I was recognizing when I was writing the fairy tales for Centaur's Wife was that the fairy tales for Heather are very much about reflecting the difficulties of the world. And the fairy tales for Tasha are very much about triumphing over the difficulties of the world. And I think fairy tales, obviously there are exceptions, but I think many fairy tales fall into those two camps where you have the happy ending, very nicely tied off story. And then you have the fairy tales that end badly and, they're very difficult and very sad. But they still, in some way, manage to connect with people who are, dealing with very difficult and sad things. And so I think my answer to that is that, again, you don't need to write for anyone other than yourself. So nobody has to write a happy story, but also B, there is a need for both of these kinds of stories out there in the world. We absolutely need escapist literature. We need escapist film and TV and all those kinds of things. I love a Marvel movie as much as the next person. But there's also still that need for the literature that's darker and, arguably depressing, that is engaging with the world in a different way. And there is room for all of these things to exist at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So the question in the chat we have from Eva is that your book started as a short story. Can you talk about the process to transform it from one to the other?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Eva. So it started, yes, as a short story that I wrote in 2014, and it was quite a short story. It was only about 2,500 words. And I belonged to a writing group at the time, and one of the writers in that group was the Hamilton writer, now California writer, Liz Harmer. And one of her comments about the story was, I feel like there could be so much more here. I want to know more about these centaurs. I want to know what drives them. And so I sat with that for probably the better part of a year and a half. And then I was working on a collection of short stories, and I had included The Centaur's Wife in that collection, but as I was revising the collection, I went back to The Centaur's Wife and expanded it, and it became a novella. And then by the time I'd finished the novella, I had sort of started thinking, so this would have been the winter of 2015, that it maybe had more to it than even that, and that it would be a novel. So at the beginning of 2016, in earnest, I think was when I really started envisioning it as a full book. And that, again, 6 or 7 drafts later, and what, 3 years, almost 4 years of writing later, it finally ended up where it is today.
Yeah, it's quite a process.
It is.
Yeah, I'm trying to finish a fiction book, but I end up just working on a poetry manuscript. And some days I think they're the same thing, and then other days I'm like, nope, they're 2 different things, and neither are done. So yeah, it's a long process.
Yep.
I have a final question, which you don't have to answer. But who exactly is the Centaur's wife in this story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you could make an argument that the Centaur's wife is, so there are centaurs in the book, for those of you who haven't read it. There are 3 centaurs in particular who are born from the union between a horse and a woman, and the horse disguises himself at the beginning of the book as a human. And so there's this thread of deception that runs through the book, which sort of shapes the centaurs' lives. And so the actual centaur's wife at the beginning of the book is the human mother of these children, who turns away from them, who refuses to allow them in her life. So there's her, and then there's Heather, who, as we read farther in the book, we discover that she has feelings for one of these centaurs that's on the mountain, and it's this very sort of forbidden desire, forbidden love kind of thing, but they also connect with one another in ways that very much have to do with each of them having and inhabiting a different kind of body than what people around them are used to, right? And then, you know, in many ways, I find the character of Tasha, who is married to a woman named Annie, for me, I find Annie to be an interesting person who could be a centaur's wife, even though she's not actually married to a centaur, because she's married to a woman who herself has gone through a certain amount of trauma and has changed as a result of that, and is occupying two different spaces at the same time, where, you know, she's trying to get back to the person that she used to be, but she's also wholly different as a result of the different kinds of griefs that she's endured. So that is a struggle for Annie as well. And yeah, you know, I think there's also an element of it too, that by the time it came, you know, down to nailing down a title for the book, it had been the story that was the centaur's wife for so long that it just sort of, it really inhabited that title for me. And the fact that for me, the centaur's wife can refer to a whole bunch of things actually just adds to the magic.
Yeah. That takes us right to, in my time zone, 3 o'clock, in your time zone, 5 o'clock. And I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So I just want to thank you so much for having this wonderful conversation with us. There's a lot of people who are really excited, I think, to put a hold on this book. There might even be a little bit of a lineup now. Michelle's laughing, so that's probably going to be the case. I should say that if you cannot buy a book, taking it out of the library or requesting it does a whole lot of good for authors, like a lot, because it tells the library that a book is wanted, and then the library can justify their decision to buy another copy. So you don't have to spend money on us, but just getting the word out is really helpful as well. So again, thank you for being here with us and for joining us all the way from Hamilton and sharing your bones with us. And I'm gonna pass it to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Nisha, for your wonderful questions. It was so wonderful to share space with you today, and I'm really honored.
This, you know, every author event we have, I'm always like, what a great conversation, what a great conversation. And again, what a great conversation, and covering so much. And for those of you watching, if you haven't read the book, it is beautiful. It's a beautiful book. So thank you, Amanda, for saying yes and for riding this roller coaster with us of, you know, can we bring you in? We don't know, like, you know, that whole thing with planning something in a pandemic. And I really do hope that we will be able to bring you in the future, and you know, do a hybrid, you know, bring you in, stream it. That would be fantastic. So Nisha, thank you. I will talk to you later. Nisha is our writer in residence. So if there are writers in the audience and you want to have a little consult, Nisha is available. And she is with us until the end, well, not quite the end of December, but into December. So she is a resource for us, and it's been fantastic. I'm going to just do some thank yous. Thank you, Celeste, for watching things in the background. Our main funder is the City of St. Albert, and the Friends of the St. Albert Public Library, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and the Canada Council for the Arts. Our media sponsors are St. Albert Gazette, T8N Magazine, and Edify Magazine. And I just want to remind everyone, you will get a survey at the end of the festival. And we want to know what you think. We want to know which authors you'd like to see at Starfest 2022. And by filling in the survey, you enter for a draw to win a set of the Starfest books, including a copy of Centaur's Wife. Starfest continues tomorrow evening. We host Joshua Whitehead, who's the author of Johnny Appleseed, another amazing book. And Joshua will be in conversation with Emily Riddle. You can still get tickets at starfest.ca. And I will say goodbye for now.